Uh, Greetings, colleagues, Motlow family, community members, and members that are beyond our quote unquote normal reach and scope and breadth. You are welcome here today. We're thankful for your time and your effort to lend your ears, your hearts, and your minds towards dreams deferred that we were bringing to fruition. Introducing Dr. Frederick Douglass Dixon is my pleasure. It is an honor to bring him back to Motlow in the capacity of a speaker to speak today about the death of Black Wall Street and the myth of the American dream. Dr. Dixon comes to us from the University of Wyoming, where he's the director of the Black Studies Center. In the celebration of Motlow and in the celebration of African American and or Black History Month, I welcome you. Dr. Dixon is not just a scholar and a gentleman. I use gentleman loosely. He is also a person who's become a friend, a confidant, and my brother in the work that we do together. So I will yield the floor in this hour of time for his blessings that he'll share with us today. Thank you in advance for the nuggets, Dr. Dixon. We're honored and appreciate you giving it to us today.
Thank you. And I'm beyond words at this point to say how grateful I am to be back at Motlow State. And I can remember this starting a couple years ago when I met some really dynamic scholars at a conference, and we were in Louisville. And the young lady said, "Would you be interested in coming to Motlow State?" I said, "Absolutely." And before you know it, I had a phone call from Mrs. Cannon. And at that point, the doors of Motlow opened, and it became a place where I understood that it was very important to share what I thought was important about the esoteric information and the role that Blacks have played in Americans' tapestry. So today will be in that vein, that we'll look at this particular event as one of the seminal events in American history, bar none, that needs to be dissected in a very critical manner, using empirical evidence and using social movements and using the idea of what's been wiped away from history as a way to add to, extend, dismantle, interrupt, and disrupt the major narrative, the dominant narrative. So we look at this in a very serious way. Well, we're talking about the death of Black Wall Street. And why are we talking about the death of Black Wall Street? Well, it's an event that we should always talk about. But I want to stop and say thanks to all the laborers. And I got to stop and say I want to thank President Torrance, who is indeed for you all and for the field of higher ed and beyond exactly what's needed at this point in America, as we see the crumbling, if you will, the beginning of the end of white supremacy. So it's very important that we understand that for the most part, when we think about the role of Blacks as being generally subservient to whites, that it may be, and I'll bless you with this, I really believe this, it may be a Black man that will save the world. Well, we've seen that before. So to understand President Torrance and his dedication and his skill level, please understand that it is far outside of the average. So please make sure you understand that. Well, you see the name, Frederick Douglass Dixon. I'm only Dixon on payday. Dixon is a constant reminder of the missing history that comes along with being in my family. Now, what I do understand about the Dixon name, it's a Scottish name. It also would remind us of at least 1619 to 1865, the transatlantic slave trade. And if I were to have the name Dixon, I would probably be the most unique Scottish man that you've ever seen in your life. So in many ways, this does not allow for me to do anything but point to what's happened, the accurate story of what happened to people who look just like me. So we chase this, we don't trace this. We chase this name back to a place in Mississippi that's called Aberdeen, Mississippi. And this part is true, whether it be ironic or whether it just be something that you can take for true. I'm from the South Side of Chicago. I grew up on a street called Aberdeen. So to look at it that way, I'm connected in so many ways, but disconnected in more ways than I'm connected to a last name. So today, we'll look at it through the lens of what Frederick Douglass says, and we'll give a critique. He said, what to the slave is the 4th of July? It's a pretty important question. July 5th, 1852, Rochester, New York. And he said, the conscience of the nation must be roused. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And its crimes against God and man must be denounced. Go where you will, search where you may, and you will agree with me that for revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without a rival. So we'll look at this entire piece through that particular lens and challenge and disrupt and interrupt the mainstream historical narrative, particularly about this event. So we are in the midst of Black History Month. And there are a couple things that we need to take directly as a way to look to Dr. Carter G. Woodson. For many of you who've never heard of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Dr. Carter G. Woodson is indeed the father of Black history as we know it, which started February 1926 as Negro History Week. And then he transforms that into a literary piece where he begins to write and challenge those with him to write about the history, the accurate history of Blacks in America. But he was born in West Virginia. He is one generation or less than one generation removed from slavery or being a slave. And the one thing that we understand about Dr. Carter G. Woodson is his vision. And when we begin to talk about his vision, we become clearer. Well, let's look at his name, Carter G. Woodson. Well, the G stands for Godwin, G-O-D-W-I-N, Godwin, Carter Godwin Woodson. And if we look at the middle name, you can also see very clearly the word God. So when we think about his brilliance, he's not your traditional student. So he doesn't go to high school until right around 19 years old because of he was mandated to work in the fields of West Virginia with his brother to support his family. So he's done with high school, Douglas High School, by 22. So he understands but eventually becomes the principal of this same high school in a very short time. So he shows his brilliance. He gets a bachelor's degree from Barrera College, 1903, a master's at the University of Chicago, 1908, and the second Black man to earn a PhD from the University of Chicago, Harvard University in 1912. So I want to take a step and look at it. Imagine what he had to go through to be a successful student at any one of these colleges during this time. University of Chicago, right now to this day, is still calling for ethnic studies. Students are still calling for ethnic studies, which means they have not addressed it. Harvard University, a PhD, second Black man to earn a PhD, but the first Black historian to earn a PhD at Harvard University. I'm not sure if you saw this recently, but there was a challenge by Cornel West, who was one of America's greatest scholars, that he wouldn't be given tenure at Harvard University. That's 2021. So it shows you just how, when we look at the core of education and how racist the core can be or is, and then we think about the organizations that he left behind. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History, 1915. And then he creates Negro History Week, February 1926. I need to go back and say, well, the first Black man to earn a PhD from Harvard University Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. So we see the greatness in their scholarship, both. But when we look at Dr. Carter G. Woodson, he creates February 26th, Negro History Week. Let us be very clear that his vision, and I wholeheartedly believe that his vision allowed for us to be able to look at what we know now as Black History Month in a way that's incorporated into the mainstream narrative. So thinking about Dr. Carter G. Woodson and his greatness, one of his seminal books of the many that he wrote about the Negro and giving a critique of many things is The Miseducation of the Negro, which was written in 1933. A couple of these quotes will show you exactly his understanding and how he and his lens became important to many who would study behind him. He said, when you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. He goes on in that same quote to say, well, if he has to cut a back door, well, you don't have to worry about it. He will cut it for himself. His education makes it necessary. The thought of the inferiority of the Negro is drilled into him in almost every class he enters and almost every book he studies. So giving our appropriate thanks and giving our appropriate praise to Dr. Carter G. Woodson allows for us to keep moving. So we do salute Dr. Carter Godwin Woodson, and we do appreciate his vision as we live it out today. So we're going to go over a few things here, and I guarantee you I can get through this in an hour. But I would encourage everybody here to feel free to use the chat to become part of our conversation, as well as any questions that you deem apropos. We will do our best to answer them all. So the major problem with the event that we call the death of Black Wall Street, or more specifically, the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, is a term called massive white resistance. It's an immediate response to perceived or practical group or individual or group Black advancement in economics, in politics, socially, but the response has always been consistently violent. And as you see, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which means there were laws on the books that were attempting to address these issues, particularly about Blacks becoming part of the body politic. And we'll go into that in much more detail. But what we want to look at is massive white resistance and it being consistently violent. My intellectual philosophy, or the lens that I bring to you today, is from the Black Scholar Activist model, forwarded by Robert Christman, and I caught it, and I was introduced to it by Dr. Sundiata Chachua from the University of Illinois, with 4 fundamental goals: contribute my knowledge of African-American history to expand the dominant discourse, to be able to speak about politics in a radical manner that challenges what we know as the political system, social movement repertoires, which will become very important in our dialogue today. And number 4, and perhaps to me the most important, challenge the mainstream historical narrative. That's what the Black scholar should do. But the Black scholar activist has to be more than one who sits in an ivory tower and writes analysis. He has to be more than one who writes great papers and books. He has to be attuned to the needs of his own population. Well, let's think about that. With this particular intellectual philosophy, let's think about that. I was speaking to 2 great people that I met today on the line, and they said, well, Dr. Dixon, let me clear this up. There is a huge difference between a doctor and earning a PhD. Let's begin with earning a PhD. Earning a PhD from a higher education institution in America, and there are only certain amounts of institutions that offer those particular degrees, then when you think about what you have been trained for, and this is where it becomes very critical. So when you have completed or you have successfully earned a PhD, you have been trained in the highest of Eurocentric education, which many times paints blacks from the dock for what we call that model that is a deficit model. So you think about folks who have gotten an associate's degree, which we know Dr. Torrance and his staff is training people every day, and they're great with their graduation rates. But that's an AA. And then we think about a BA, a bachelor's degree, when you have successfully understood and completed undergraduate rigor. And then we think about an MA, that's a master's degree. The question becomes, what did you master? Well, 9 times out of 10, it's a Eurocentric thought. 9 times out of 10, what you have mastered is this understanding and these bridges for you to place in a very important position an iconic whiteness, that you look to this iconic whiteness to justify your ability to understand what education really does. And then you got a PhD. And a lot of times when we say that master's degree and what you've mastered, and then that PhD, that's piled higher and deeper. So if you understand an AA, a BA, a MA, and a PhD, and you allow it as a black person to set you apart from those who are like you, who you are supposed to serve, then that AA, that BA, that MA, and that PhD can all add up to BS. So please understand what Eurocentric education does, and that's what Carter G. Woodson was talking about when he said to understand the miseducation of the Negro. So let's talk about the doctor. There's a huge difference. I'm separating these things on purpose. The PhD we've discussed, but what about the doctor, the black doctor? Well, if the black doctor is accurate, if he is equipped from a Eurocentric education to be a part of the uplifting of his community, then he would be able to effectuate a positive change. So I think about the black sociologists, and we have many black sociologists. But then I think about the current and the past situations and the remnants of the black society. Well, we have black sociologists, black psychologists, and we look at the current condition of the black psyche. So in many ways, what the Eurocentric education does for blacks, it does not equip them to deal directly with the problems that are most abhorrent in the black community. So the role of the research, I want to explain this to you all, and maybe this will clear up a lot of things. I'm second generation educator, historian. And to the left, you see my father, the Honorable Professor Willie Dixon Jr. in the Ebony magazine when the Chicago DuSable Museum celebrates its 32nd anniversary. And I think this is 1994. So I'm a second generation historian, lifelong Chicagoan from the South Side. Now I'm an assistant professor and director of the University of Wyoming's Black Studies Center, but my agenda with research discusses social movement, particularly the nadir of the American lynching movement. So let us begin by looking at, if you will, if it's proper, then we should begin at the beginning. January 1st, 1863, with the Emancipation Proclamation, one thing that it did, it changed the status of over 3 million blacks from servitude to freed man, if you will, loosely speaking, freed man status. But this is where the idea of white massive resistance changes. So as you all know better than I in Tennessee, as close as you are, white massive resistance begins immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. First Klan, 1866, Pulaski, Tennessee, Mr. Lester, Mr. Crow, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Reed, and Mr. McCord, as a way to show their resistance of the status of the newly freed slave. And how does that paint the picture? It paints it very violently. So from the very beginning of so-called emancipation, there was this immediate massive resistance. And let us go to the Mohawk Conference on the Negro Question. Well, the Mohawk Conference on the Negro Question was the first conference that was brought about, and I'm sorry, it took place in New York, Usler Hotel in Mohawk, New York. And the idea was to have this dialogue between the North and the South that would indeed attempt to patch up or atone for and bring together the separation and those things that were differences between the North and the South. But I have to read to you the Negro Question. And if you haven't heard it, please pay attention and understand that some of these things are quite natural to the ear, but we want to lay them out to you in a historic sense. And I would also ask you to fact check what I'm saying. Feel free to. So if you're busy right now fact checking, then you know I'm correct. So the Negro Question in itself reads, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? I want to read that again. What should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? Let's stop it right there. Rutherford B. Hayes presided over this conference. And what came out of this conference was an agreement between the North and the South to say how we will move, how we will live amongst the newly freed slave in the 20th century will be separate but equal. So I hope everybody's understanding that we're using a timeline to lay this out to you. So from the highest pulpit, we see that the North and the South have gotten to a point where they can at least sit in the same room. But what comes out of this? The way to deal with the Negro Question. And that will be Plessy versus Ferguson. You see that term de jure. That means of the jury. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, was about challenging railroad cars, which was the most, and transportation on railways, which was the most up-to-date and contemporary way that people travel. But one thing you got to realize about Mr. Plessy was 7th, 8th white. So he looked like a white man. But when we think about this, this is going from de facto, meaning the Mohawk Conference, to de jure, meaning the law of the land. So it goes from a thought of separate but equal to law of the land that dominates, which still reads separate but equal. Now we can break that term down, particularly those of us who were looking at this as a way to look at their own inferiority. So separate but equal. Well, we know it was separate, but one thing is it was not equal. So this is how America goes into the 20th century. Now, thinking about Tulsa, you see this picture of this beautiful Black woman. This is Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells had an incident in Memphis, March 9th, 1892. It's called the lynching at the curve. So feel free to write that down, to research that. It's very accessible. I'm sure with one simple Google search, you'll come up with this, but I want to explain this and share this with you to understand how Tulsa becomes one of those spaces where Blacks look to as a haven, if you will, of opportunity. So there was a place that was owned by Mr. Thomas Moss called the People's Grocery Store. And there was a rival grocery store that was owned by a white man that was across the street. Now, this was in the Black community. So what do we see from a long time ago? That even though we're separate but unequal, there is this interest in the Black dollar, to dominate the Black dollar, to control the Black dollar. But going into these communities for whites was much different than Blacks going into white communities. Let's go back to separate but equal. And there was this incident where two young men began to fight, one white and one Black. And Mr. Will Stewart broke the fight up, but allowed the little Black boy to beat up the little white boy. So there was this immediate response that came from that. And about a week later, after several skirmishes, and one of those skirmishes left a white man dead. So the immediate response to that, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart were all shot and killed. Now, Ida B. Wells was Thomas Moss's daughter's godmother. That's how close they were. So she writes a scathing critique of what happens here. She also makes sure that her social capital as this anti-lynching crusader and as one who writes very poignant critiques of lynching, that folks begin to look to her for answers. So what does she do? She encourages those folks in Memphis to move west to Tulsa. This is as early as 1892. Now, this information, particularly this date, will become important, but she gives the thumbs up. Her social capital, in a very straightforward way, creates what we call a mini migration, particularly folks who are leaving from Memphis to Oklahoma. She says, go to Tulsa. But one thing that comes out of it is after she writes this scathing critique of what happened to her close friends, one thing happens. She's not able to go back to Memphis. So she has to leave her newspaper behind, and she eventually moves to Chicago. But this becomes very important when we think about the importance of Ida B. Wells' legacy and social capital. So let's discuss 4 stages of a social movement using the turn of the century. So it's emergence, where that's normally an event that galvanizes the social movement. So we think about the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, Brown versus Board of Education, and the assassination of Emmett Till. Coalescence. This is when people begin to understand what this movement is, and it becomes conversation for the masses. So it becomes popular. One way to look at that, the March on Washington, then the civil rights movement. And the high point. And the high point normally represents the beginning of the end, bureaucratization. Bureaucratization, stage 3, is when the ruling regime has a chance to respond to a social movement and they begin to quash it. So after that comes decline. Now, of course, you all, there is overlap in each one of these stages, but we wanted to lay this out to you so that we can look at the American lynching movement. And what we see here is at the bottom on the right, you have these people who have become freed men, but who return back to peonage in many ways as soon as they were, if you will, set free. So sharecropping. And right above that is one of the Reconstruction's greatest pictures, and we began to see these men who are elected out of South Carolina. And then we think about the American lynching movement. I need to stop right there. The American lynching movement may be the longest social movement in America. So we're looking at a picture from 1931 in Marion, Indiana. But the American lynching movement began to point its vestiges and its negative effects at Blacks when they were so-called free. So the body transforms from property to free, and go back to what they said in the Mohawk Conference, a problem. So when we think about the American lynching movement, most folks say the anti-lynching movement. There'd be no need for an anti-lynching movement if there weren't a lynching movement. So when we think about this, 4 stages, at least 4 stages to a social movement. We want to be right and exact. The nadir of the American lynching movement. That means the worst part, the worst of the worst when we think about the nadir of the American lynching movement. Well, according to historian Rayford Logan, 1877 through the early 20th century, and I can agree with that. But when we begin to look at the 40s, at the 30s, even up into the 50s, we can say the nadir of the American lynching movement lasted more than 50 years. So this sign that you see was the NAACP office in New York. And that means, literally and figuratively, that this was not, the lynching movement was not bound just to the South. Let's go over some very important events that set the stage for the death of Black Wall Street. First, one that many of you all have heard of is the Birth of a Nation movie in 1915. Why is this movie so important? Well, there's a couple ways to look at it. One way to look at it is its cinematic value, like how this became an iconic movie. Well, this was America's first motion picture. But let's look at it in two ways: cinematic realism and racist propaganda. So let's go with one side, what it did in a cinematic sense, and then another side, what it did in a social sense. So the young man's name was Thomas Frederick Dixon Jr. That's way too close to my name. But there was a play that he wrote called The Klansman, and another play called The Leopard Spots, which talked about Reconstruction, which talked about the problem of America during Reconstruction was that the changing of the status from slaves to freedmen. And this great producer, this great mover and shaker, D.W. Griffith.
No, la clase de matemáticas no canceló hoy. Entonces ya estoy libre si quieren.
So I have to stop right there, you all. On the 15th of February, we had a part of a cinematic festival, a 3-part series here at the University of Wyoming. And we were bombed, Zoom bombed, with racist and pornographic material. So if you all want to look into that, because it's gone all across the country, all you have to do is Google racist and pornographic interruption at the University of Wyoming, and it'll pop right up. So I'm a little sensitive now to those things happening because I think they're following me. But today, as we go through it, I want to get back to the idea of what this movie meant. This movie in itself, when we talk about cinematic realism, how a movie can turn into something that people look at in a practical sense. Now, what this movie did, this movie in itself said that the problem in politics was that Black men were being elected. So they have a problematic nature and they are not fit to rule. They're not trained to rule. They don't have the capacity to rule, the propensity to rule in a way that white men do. So another thing that comes out of this idea of the rise of this Aryan, this call for an Aryan nation. And it, by 1915, represents the seminal event for the rise of the second wave of the Ku Klux Klan. So impressed by this film was the entire country, particularly those who had a stake in status quo, that it went as far as the White House. President Woodrow Wilson, a Southern racist, and I'm going to quote him right now. He said the movie was like history written with lightning. So from the top of the bell tower to those who were the most challenged financially, socially, who were white men, they agreed that this movie and Birth of a Nation was the idea of being able to reclaim, if you will, reclaim the idea of white supremacy. This is a seminal event. And think about 1915. It becomes very important. World War I, let's use 1917, 1919 through that time. And what we see is a radicalization of Black soldiers. So what does war and what does being a part of the armed forces really do? Well, first of all, it trains one for battle. So they take someone that you and I both know from our community and they change their mental process and they change their physical being. So when Blacks fought in World War I, they got a chance to train their bodies. And they also got a chance to travel to Europe. So imagine one from the South, where he sees very limited options, but what he sees is this overarching blanket of white supremacy. And it's part of who he is, his psychovisceral and driven by, and furthermore, it is backed up with this violent threat of death daily. So when we think about how they fought valiantly, and when they returned home to Jim Crow. So one of the things as a part of white massive resistance was to lynch World War I Black soldiers in their uniform, in their community. But out of this comes this continuum of Blacks fighting valiantly in violent situations for American, well, this is where America becomes a superpower. So a couple groups that you can look to, the Harlem Hellfighters and the Buffalo Soldiers. Now the Buffalo Soldiers go way back. They go way back. We find them with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, but the Buffalo Soldiers, Bob Marley sang of them, and they'll become important in the death of Black Wall Street. But as they return to Jim Crow, there's an immediate response that meets them at home. The Red Summer of 1919. Let's take a step back and go to Birth of a Nation and go to World War I. These are all events that lead up to the death of Black Wall Street. So the Red Summer, and when we think about the Red Summer of 1919, the Red Summer, the color red and the term Red Summer represents a particular period of time, and it also, the color red, represents the blood that was spilled. So we saw in many cities this outlash, this white massive resistance, this violent outlash against Blacks in a segregated
So damn
society.
tired and got black folks.
So when we think about the Red Summer, it gives credence to, and even before then, this mob mentality. Now, what does the mob mentality do, particularly in a lynching situation? It usurps, it goes right past the 15th Amendment. It does not give one the chance to be proven guilty or even looked to as innocent until proven guilty. So the Red Summer becomes the forerunner, if you will, the pregame, if you will, to the death of Black Wall Street. And we see how close these numbers are. And then you think about how this went across America. There was no part of America that was not touched in 1919. The social conditions and determinants of the Red Summer. A phenomenon of the first wave of the Great Migration. Many of us have connections to living in the South and the Great Migrations being that which transported many of our foreparents, or what I call our grandparents, to northern cities. They say about 2 million Blacks left the South in the first wave of the Great Migration. And let's look at what that did to northern cities. Well, New York, 66% increase. Chicago, 148% increase of Blacks. Philadelphia, 500. Detroit, 611. So imagine the pushback when there's this massive exodus from the South and Blacks came to northern cities and became problematic because they filled in for striking workers at much less pay rate. So that creates animus between Black working class and white working class. So Blacks moved from, let's say, plantations and acres of land to very small one-room unit tenements in the North. But you need to understand that all of a sudden, if you will, in a very short time, there are 2 million Blacks that were not there 10 years ago. So this causes a problem. Now this is, and I have you guys look to right in the middle at the top, the Chicago Defender, one of America's greatest Black news outlets. And let us be very clear. When we read about events in mainstream newspapers, and then during this time, Black newspapers, we see the telling of two different scenarios, two different tales, very close to how now when we watch certain news outlets that we find two different stories being told. But let's look at it. Riots sweep Chicago. Again, I told you I'm from Chicago. So this is very dear to me. And if you look on the front page in big, bold letters, riots sweep Chicago. And look how much that newspaper costs. 5 cents. August 2nd, 1919. So this is the end of the summer. So the beginning of the summer was bloody. The center or the middle of the summer was bloody. Up until August, it's still very bloody and very violent. So when we think about how this leads up to the death of Black Wall Street, what we see is this list. What we see is this pattern of very violent outbursts, outward manifestations against Blacks by whites. So in Chicago, Blacks do become strike breakers. And when we think about how they are limited to a small part of Chicago called the Black Belt, well, many famous people came out of that Black Belt. Jack Johnson was a part of that Black Belt. Ida B. Wells was very close to that Black Belt. Adam C.J. Walker, very close to that Black Belt. So there's this understanding that there's a nation within America's larger nation of Blacks, separate but equal. Chicago 1919. The young man that you see to the top is Mr. Eugene Moore, a 19-year-old who was swimming on a tube in Lake Michigan, and the water currents took him into a spot that's designated for white only. And there was a group, an Irish group called the Hamburgs, who pelted him with rocks until he drowned. This set off not just a riot, but a response of Blacks that they would no longer, and I don't think they ever did in Chicago, it's just that we don't have enough information about it, that they would allow for this to happen. So what we see at the bottom is Mayor Richard J. Daley, at one time, the most powerful mayor in America. His legacy reads that he delivered the Union vote that pushed Kennedy to be the 35th president of the United States and the very first Irish Catholic president. Mayor Daley was an Irish Catholic. And for years, he ruled Chicago with ethnic politics. So during the summer of 1919, he was supposedly there. He took place in the assassination of Eugene Moore. And later he creates a political revolution that for years is now called Chicago's Democratic Machine. So when we look at it in its conclusion, more than 36 cities, and I want you to understand this, most of the cities where there was riots took place in towns with populations less than 50,000 people. Those that become very popular or those that are talked about more than others, Elaine, Arkansas. Close to 240 Blacks were killed. Chicago, 38, Washington, 15. That pales in comparison to what was happening in the South in Arkansas during this same time. And that's why it earns the reputation of the Red Summer. Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now we have built up to this. Now the key issues seem to be control over the oil. So Tulsa was an oil town separated by a bridge. And the white power structure did not want the oil being controlled by blacks or those who are indigenous to that particular part. This comes from Robin Walker's book, The Rise and Fall of Black Wall Street, which I recommend. So if you're still following me, we are recommending additional readings. But if we take a timestamp, by 1905, blacks had begun to buy land, which we know causes problematic issues with white men, that blacks become landowners. So if you understand that 15 years before the death of Black Wall Street, if you take a step back and look at 1893, and Ida B. Wells called for blacks to move to Tulsa, this is how it becomes Black Wall Street, where they say that dollar circulated 36 times in the black community before it left. But let's never forget the idea of what separate but equal does to this equation. So there are a lot of ways to look at this, but it boils down to an encounter between a young man named Dick Rowland and a young lady named Sarah Page. Sarah Page was an elevator operator in the Drexel building downtown. Now this took place on the Memorial holiday, so a lot of the stores and a lot of the businesses were closed. Dick Rowland was a shoe shine young man, and that was one of the only buildings where he could use the washroom. They say that and this is what becomes very questionable, that he was on the elevator and he assaulted Sarah Page. Well, we know in many instances that all that has to be done is an allegation made against a black man about the sanctity or the needed protection of a white woman to spark what we know as a white mob. So Dick Rowland in himself was an orphan and was raised by the state of Oklahoma. And this is what people don't understand. So was Sarah Page. So it's come out years later that they knew each other. They stayed in some of the same facilities. And what also has come out with this is they may have been lovers. Goes back to what Ida B. Wells was saying. If we understand her writings, it's something called Southern Horrors that you should get, where she gives the first mixed methodology research on lynching by a black person. First mixed methodology research on lynching, period, but by a black woman. And what she says in that is pretty soon you won't be able to continue to use the same excuse about black men raping white women for why you lynched them. So as normal, local white citizens gathered at the courthouse to do what? Mob justice, to usurp the 15th Amendment, to usurp the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment. Rights as citizens, as we know. But what happened at this particular point? Black World War I veterans assembled. Now, we talked about them being radicalized during World War I, and a lot of these young men were part of the Buffalo Soldiers. So there was a standoff. 12 people were killed at this particular space. 10 were white. Imagine the angst of white Tulsa men when 10 white men were killed in a retaliation or a protection of a black man. So this lasted 3 days. And in many folks, single worst incident of racial violence in American history. Well, let's make sure we understand this clearly. The Gap area, everybody knows that it's called Greenwood, but there were a couple more streets, Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, with the Gap area. They said that's the wealthiest community in America of blacks. So let's begin to look at this in many ways. So after the very first night, then whites came and literally burned down the Black Wall Street. Now, what becomes really interesting, and I think that if you will, this is, as we saw earlier, a black news outlet. This is the mainstream news outlet. Please take just a little time and read this over, please. So if this is the mainstream narrative being told by, and the narrative controlled by white media, then it would be of upper importance to be able to compare and contrast this to what came from a black news outlet. This seems like this is fairly accurate. So what became of this, and we'll look at the implications in just a bit, and we'll go over them in great detail. Thousands of whites came to Tulsa to do what? Destroy the black community, kill and maim. And you see, this is from a newspaper clip, that there was indeed Klan members who led the charge in full regalia. Left about 10,000 black people homeless. But let's make sure we understand it in a clear and concise manner. These folks had gone from renters to homeowners in less than a generation. And then overnight, they're homeless. Well, in 2009, they said right around $32 million. But to be more accurate, it would take more of a concerned effort to research that. So we use that, but we caution you to say that we don't give that empirically our blessing, because it's too round of a number. But let's think about what happened. Burning and looting of stores, 3 black banks, more than 1 black newspaper. They didn't just burn these places down, they looted, they pillaged, they went into people's homes. So one of the things that they did was they began to burn down these homes, and all of a sudden there was a land grab that was put together. So not just burning the homes down, but taking the land, which was land that was bought by blacks. This is something that is an actual picture. June 1st. Little Africa is on fire. They call this a riot. No, this was a massacre. McNulty Ballpark was a minor league baseball park. And after the 3rd day of this massacre, they rounded blacks up and put them in this minor league ballpark. And you know what? The city of Tulsa, the state of Oklahoma, and the United States government did? They flew World War I airplanes over the ballpark and dropped bombs in them. So let's go back to the Gap, the nickname of the area, the Greenwood, Archer, and Pine, the Gap area. There's some of you that are with us right now who remember the Gap Band, which was from that area. And one of their greatest successful songs was called You Dropped the Bomb on Me. And what that is explaining is their understanding of their ancestors who were bombed in that ballpark. Now they couple it, or they place it on the table as if this is a relationship. But what they're doing is giving you their insight. And if you can remember that song, it says, you dropped the bomb on me, baby. And it repeats it, and it repeats it. And there's a video, and if you see that video, it's very interesting how they lay it out. And they use World War I airplanes in a cartoon sense to explain to you that they knew exactly who did it, how they got away with it, and what went on. Social implications as we begin to wrap this up. What is normally used as a way to lynch, maim, and kill, one of the key things was the protection of white women from black men. Another social implication, massive resistance to perceived or realistic advancement of blacks was cause for a violent reaction. And historically and educationally, what has been done? This event is erased from the historical context. And what I've learned when I gave a lecture in Tulsa, which I felt so out of place, giving a lecture to folks in Tulsa about their own community, is that the folks who knew the very least about this came from Tulsa. So erasing this, removing this from the narrative has worked greatly. Economic implications, loss of over 1,000 homes. several hundred businesses, but the key to this is generational capital. It was erased that this would be passed on to generations. So you think about Black Wall Street and you think about what it would be now when we think about how a majority of whites receive upward mobility transitions, trajectories, because of generational capital. So it's very important that you understand generational capital was erased. Home ownership was erased. So what's at stake with this piece? Until we critically examine America's most violent massacre that we know, and let us be very clear, a lot of these things we just don't know because they've been erased. It's the seminal event that constitutes the nadir of the American lynching movement. We think about what education has done, systematically erase these events and compromise the mainstream historical narrative. And what we should do with this, expand, and what it does, expands the lens of inquiry by highlighting the importance of exploring the economic component that Ida B. Wells brought into the critique of the American lynching movement. Now, I say to you all, thank you for hanging with us. And I want to look into the chat to see if I can answer these couple questions I got. But as I do, I ask for you all to please feel free to unmute yourselves and pose questions, comments, concerns. I would love to hear from you. We don't have questions. So anybody, comments, concern, please feel free.
I'll go ahead.
Go ahead, please. Can you tell me your name?
Dr. Monica Butler. I teach.
Okay, Dr. Butler, nice to meet you.
Motlow. You too. I'm so glad that you took the time out of your schedule to present this. Thank you for laying the groundwork as well before leading up to the Tulsa riots. I guess my question is I'm trying to pull everything together because you started out by talking a lot about what I would call an embedded scholar in terms of integrating scholarship and community work. And I was glad you talked about that and the history of that with Carter G. Woodson. So my question is, and I wrote it down to make sure I'm staying on track.
Well, it's all right, Dr. Butler. Take your time. I'm with you. Take your time.
So by necessity, Black communities establish successful communities, and that's important to support Black excellence. You touched on, and we know in history that Cold War policies as well as desegregation policies disrupted those successful communities and disrupted that path towards Black excellence. And we're seeing the effects of that now in a lot of communities. For those that may not follow what I'm talking about, North Nashville is a great example that North Nashville was a very thriving Black community once upon a time until interstate came through, eminent domain, and really destabilizing that. Mm-hmm. So as one embedded scholar to another, okay. Where are things going? Because there are some scholars out there, historians, who say that desegregation hurt Black America. What are your thoughts on that? And especially reflecting on Tulsa and what happened in Tulsa in particular, I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you. And to look at it, and I thank you for the term embedded scholar. But again, I go back to the lens that I proposed from the very beginning of the Black scholar activist model. I do believe that there's a direct connection to integration and the downfall of Black economics. Many would say, particularly if you took the thoughts of the Nation of Islam and the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad, they would say it was a hypocritical trick. So by, as you said, by need, these communities all across the country, separate but equal in the most affluent cities or the spaces that are the most rural, we saw this understanding of economy and what that did. And there was also And let's think about it clearly. I can remember my grandmother and my grandfather not being formally educated, but by the time their death was upon us, they left my father, my aunts, lots of property. There was this idea to concentrate on buying property for the next generation. Sacrifice for those you'll never see. And many folks don't understand the one thing that they'll never make again is property. So I do believe, and that goes for the Black Scholar activist model, that there is a part of American economics that because of the want to be accepted as equals into white institutions, we lost so very much economically and other ways by attempting to integrate. So I am of the thought that when Jackie Robinson entered Major League Baseball, the Negro Leagues began to fall. So I think it's quite obvious, but we have to think that all that we have gone through, Doctor, at that point, it would take the understanding of a W.E.B. Du Bois and a Booker T. Washington and a Marcus Garvey and the most honorable Elijah Muhammad, and not separate those thoughts, but combine those thoughts. So every time we had a leader during these times that began to put forth an effort and a program of progress that we could readily discern was feasible, we seem to see that our leaders became targets. Their movements became shambles. And right now, to this day, when we think about white massive resistance, Doc, I think these are the scions of those folks who on January 6th ran into the Capitol and expressed their discontent for what they thought that was taken from them. White privilege. So I thank you for the question. I hope I answered it, because coming from a doctor, I want to make sure I'm right and exact. But I thank you for it.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to that. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. We got something from Samisha Talley. She said, what do you think it takes to get back to Black Wall Street for Black people? Well, we have to understand how we have been placed in positions of authority, some of us, particularly the most educated of our group, that would allow for material culture to outweigh the idea of group advancement. So that's always a very tricky angle. So when we see the most astute, when we see those who are the most successful, usually that means a very significant amount is done in single file fashion. And we still have not come back to grips with the idea of unification, meaning we have many things that stand in our way when we think about unification. But one of them that we can charge to our own self is our inability to be able to unify, mobilize, and organize, because a lot of folks do not like to take orders from people who they think they're smarter than. So that's a myriad of ways of looking at it. And I hope that I did answer your question, Ms. Talley. Do we have another question from the audience? Feel free.
To kind of piggyback off what you just mentioned.
Can you tell me your name?
My name is Jalen Smith.
Okay, Jalen, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. I enjoyed the presentation, by the way, as well.
Thank you.
Just the comment you made about Jackie Robinson and how he actually entered the majors and left the Negro Leagues. And to piggyback off the last question you just answered about how we can actually get back to that type of Black Wall Street and actually, I guess, kind of see that happen again. When I think of sports, or if you want to make the change for us as like a group of people that have been so oppressed so far, the only battle that we actually have a sword in is not in how like they would massacre our cities or anything like that. Like we can't act like that. We have no means of making anything like that happen. So we just have to play the game of money, right? So when I see kids in high school basketball, and I'm just using basketball as an example here, like that's a big financial institution, right? They generate a lot of revenue. If my biggest problem with it is that a lot of players are kind of playing ball for these schools that have been known to be inherently racist in history. They generally do use these students for their talent, and you know, in most cases they don't have any plan B, and they don't really have a plan to help these kids when they don't succeed in the next level, if they don't get there, you know. So when I see high prospects as of last year, top ranking prospects considering foregoing college, and actually if they were to actually go to a college school, they would choose an HBCU. Like that's a big step towards something like that, in my opinion, because there's a lot of money invested in kids that aren't even 18 yet that play sports like that.
Absolutely.
If we can generate that type of revenue for those HBU programs, I mean, how would that change things going forward? I just want to hear your thoughts on that because of your comment about Jackie
let
Robinson.
me talk to you from the vein of one who played college basketball and one who has a nephew right now that plays major college basketball and everything in between that. I think one of the major problems that you're pointing out to that I want to be more direct to is the AAU system. I think that is in itself a minor league for many different problematic issues. But to speak directly to what you mentioned about this movement to have some of the best players in the country every year sign on with an HBCU. Well, I think that it's happening. So there was a young man, and I know he's still playing at Alabama State. His name is Trace Young. Trace Young started his career here at the University of Wyoming. After he left his freshman year, he went to a community college, and then he signed with Alabama State. So he's one of those young men that was in the middle of this movement. And I think it was very short-lived, but I do think it still has legs. But I think that you're correct when you say that if we can harness some of that academic prowess to HBCUs, then I think that major college basketball, top college football becomes a much different space because we see Deion Sanders now at Jackson State. So I think it's on in the conversation. I just don't think that those top athletes can look at or overlook the resource difference when they are at a HBCU than when they're at a major college. So I think it's more than one particular vein, but a lot of it comes down to resources, what they will and won't have access to. But if you want to look to someone who set that model, who became part of it, look to a young man now at Alabama State. His name is Trace Young. Love the kid because that's the type of person he is. So I hope I answered your question, Mr. Jalen. There's a question here that says, if you don't mind, could you tell me your thought about the Black Star Line? Well, let's look at the Garvey program overarching and then talk about the Black Star Line. Marcus Mosiah Garvey, as we know, headed the most successful Black social movement, Black freedom movement, Black liberation movement, perhaps in the annals of American history. Now, what made it great was that it only took 4 people to have a chapter of the UNIA, and that's the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So to have a secretary, a treasurer, a president, and a secretary, a treasurer, a vice president, and a president. And then you had a chapter of the UNIA. That was brilliant. So you saw folks all across the globe. Wherever there was Black folks, there was somebody tied into Marcus Garvey's UNIA. I do believe that the Black Star Line was problematic for his movement because of how those particular boats, I mean, what they couldn't do, they couldn't hold up. They were not good boats. And I think he paid for that financially, but he also took a hit with his legacy because of that failure. But that does not in any way lessen the importance of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey and his movement for Black liberation. And I'm glad that you brought that up because this is a great time, and it's always a great time to think about Marcus Garvey and what he left back. If you think about some of those folks who were part of the UNIA, Marcus Garvey's UNIA, Reverend Little, who gave birth to Malcolm X, the most honorable Elijah Muhammad, held a position as a corporal. So when we think about his movement, yes, I think that was one part that we can critique even further as something that became very problematic. So I hope I answered that question as well. And do we have another question?
Dr. Dixon, hello.
Yes.
Hi. Enjoyed the presentation very much. I had
Tell
a
me
quick
your
question.
name.
My name is Deborah, actually, and that was my son Jalen, who I had invited. I attend Motlow, but I invited him and my sister. So I was
Thank you
like,
so much
great.
for inviting him. Jalen nailed it.
Yeah, great. I was like, great question,
It
son.
must be
So-
something going on right in that household.
Well, the question that I have is that I do not remember when I was in high school, even, I mean, there was not a lot about the civil rights movement. There was not a lot between after slavery, after 1865, all the way to maybe barely touching on maybe one, like 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated. There was really nothing. And if anything, it was very brief and kind of small. They talked more about, other like times in America, but just touched on like the Black history part, the pertinent parts. And the question I have is, there are lots of people in this country who, I mean, they're totally ignorant of anything. I mean, even when it comes to slavery, there's still some textbooks that really whitewash it. It really minimizes it. I have people that are my age who say, the Civil War wasn't about slavery. Are you crazy? And if they tout a Confederate flag, they say, well, it was just part of my heritage. Either it's what they've been taught and what they choose to believe, or it's just the ignorance of history. And now, even I think it was maybe a week or two ago, I think it was in Texas, there was some parents at a school board meeting wanting to literally get rid of any kind of Black History Month, or even some text that talked about slavery, and all of those things have been happening. How can that be changed? Does it start on like a local level all the way up to a federal level? Is that to be lobbied? How can we incorporate what you taught today? Is so what, like, if more people knew about these things, you almost wonder how it would change even a little bit of how people perceive the reason why people protest, not riot, because riot sometimes, yeah, it's warranted, right? When people just are being killed. In my opinion, I don't advocate for violence, but violence is done to people who, what choice do they have? I mean, you can go down that rabbit hole, but what do you say about, or what do you think is a way that we can incorporate more of this type of education, which is a part of our history? It is our history, our American history, that so many even now want to try to erase because maybe of an agenda or denial or ignorance or the need or the desire to keep white supremacy and racism alive. I mean, so that's my question. I mean, I did not learn even about Emmett Till until I watched Eyes on the Prize that came on PBS, if you remember that way back.
I do.
Yes, and that was the very first time, I was 17 years old, that I ever even heard of Emmett Till. And, I mean, I think we learned about Marcus Garvey, we did, but it was just like, but it was almost in a negative light that I remember. Yeah, like the Back to Africa, like why? That was so, that was something they included, but not everything else. And when I presented that to my junior year, the teacher was a teacher who was too young for the draft, but had a brother that was in Vietnam. So he even taught us about Vietnam that no other teacher could teach us. So a lot of the white students were apologizing, they were crying. And it hit me like, I'm just as new to this as you, but the reaction was different. So I wonder, I mean, I was just totally, I mean, I'm obsessed with Emmett Till and Mamie Till to this day, and everything else that I've learned that I've had to gather myself. Sure. How can we get more of these children and even more people who are older than me to learn about this stuff that is the reason why we're here today?
Well, you gave us a lot right there, but I think we can partial through it. First of all, to give it an overview, history has never lied. So-called historians lie all the time. So in the crafting of history, in those books that you mentioned, in the idea of understanding the difference between lies of omission and lies of commission, there's only one thing that unites them. They're both lies. So when you find a system that is to perpetuate the status quo, that means a separation of humanity, then you would find, like you say, you pointed right to a group of folks who said they want to remove Black history from the curriculum. Well, normally you get Dr. King, you get a little piece of Rosa Parks, and now they're inviting Malcolm X to the table. And this is definitely history to maintain America's status quo. So when you think about how these formal education settings become, if you will, cemeteries for a lot of these Black minds, then it's by some doing of those who look just like us, right? They go into the classroom and refuse to say certain things because of their connection or their separation from minor middle class rewards. So to inject these things, here's what I say, that you can't expect for a white supremacist teaching to do anything else but keep you in a position of inferiority. So those trainings have to come outside of the formal curriculum. So there is no way that you can look to with a reasonable expectation. But then again, sometimes you will find a teacher. Sometimes you will find a space for somewhere like for your son to, he goes with other young Black men and they have these conversations. But in itself, it's the idea of American history and what it does, which is part of the American educational system, which when we think about it now, why does it rank so low in the world? Because we know that on its best day, it's training folks to be subjects. And what does it do to Blacks? It trains them to be more willing tools for their oppressors. So to understand Marcus Garvey and to have that conversation, well, in a empirical and factual sense, that probably needs to be a conversation that happens outside of a formal classroom. So to continue to look to those who have historically set the pace about a miseducation, we talked about that, then I think that there are ways that have to be outside of what we know as traditional education to bring about those mindsets. But I thank you for your question, and I hope I answered it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And tell your son I said thank you.
I certainly will.
All right. So I think we got a few. Whitney says, do you have any advice about opening up a conversation about racism? I am biracial and try to educate my white family members, and they get defensive when I try to educate them on racism against Black people. Do you have any advice on how to educate family members? Well, I think that's a really tough task, and I think it's even grown even harder to deal with our current social atmosphere. Our current social atmosphere is so charged about this feeling that white supremacy is crumbling, and it is. And we think about it in a practical sense. Well, there are so many ways that folks are being disenfranchised to vote. That's something practical. So to have those conversations, you have to be able to expect resistance and justifications for those things that are empirically correct. Now, if you don't mind being the bad person in the family, then you can shoot it straight. But you have to have some savvy to talk to some of your elders about some of the things that are completely part of who they are, at their fiber, at their core. So it's very important that the truth enter the picture. That doesn't mean that you have to water it down. It just means you have to be ready for people not to accept it. But that doesn't mean you don't introduce the conversation. So to educate whites, let's say generally speaking, about racism, you have to understand those mechanisms and those strategies and techniques that allow for white supremacy to continue and further fester and multiply. And then you have to be able to point to those directly in a very clear sense. So if you are of the mind that you need to go along to get along, well, those people have historically been problems in these kind of conversations. But I do believe that when you are equipped, and even when you're trying to be equipped and learning to be equipped, that those conversations needed, they are very needed. Now, they're not popular, but being expedient and being popular, that doesn't last long anyway. So I say to have that conversation, make sure you're vested in your own research that puts you in a situation where you use the truth to set the pace. So I hope I answered that question, but that is a tough situation, but it can be done. Okay, Ms. Talley, thank you for your kind thoughts. And if we have any other questions, I'd be willing to field a couple more. How about two more? What are your thoughts about the 1619 project? I think that amongst other different projects, it has value, but it can't be the lone voice. It can't be controlled by philanthropy that's outside of the Black community if you're looking for clarity. But I do believe that it has a way to interject into a conversation the idea of the atrocities of the transatlantic slave trade. We know for sure 1619 is the incorrect dates for the transatlantic slave trade. We know by at least 1555, some say 1553, that, you know, John Hawkins, and then later Sir Walter Raleigh. So when it comes to that, we need to be quite honest that to start the conversation and to keep the conversation going is important. So I think they've brought that, but we have to be very wary. We have to be very aware of those who control the narrative. How do you change the narrative? You change the narrator. How do you change the victim? How do you change victimology? You change the victim. So until we are talking and explaining this from those of us who are dedicated, meaning willing to die, and on the other side of that coin, if you're willing to die, you got to be willing to kill for the advancement of those folks that you'll never meet. And I find it very difficult to find a group of Black professionals that are willing to sacrifice a lot, particularly when things come down to material culture and their ability to hoard material culture as a way to express their success. So Dr. Carter G. Woodson called it a miseducation of the Negro. In fact, what he said, chapter 1, paragraph 1, and chapter 1 is titled The Seat of Trouble. He said, the educated Negro has an attitude of contempt. It's absolutely true. Okay, Chad, thank you very much. I'm glad that you felt it was time well spent. I really enjoyed myself, and I'd be willing to take another question. Anybody, feel free.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dixon.
Can you tell me your name?
Yeah, my name is Sang Hoon-byun.
Okay, how you doing?
Yeah, good. Very
Nice to meet you.
nice to meet you, Dr. Dixon. Thank you very
And
much.
thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture. About the Black Star Line, I heard that there is a White Star Line. Yeah, and I'm just wondering if Black Star Line achieves some economic success, will be history change or same thing like a Tulsa again?
Well, I think that what it did was it provided this example, a practical example of how to trade internationally. Now, were there complications that became part of its demise? Yeah. And I'm not familiar with the White Star Line at all, but if there's a Black Star Line, I would not be surprised if there was a White Star Line. So cultural appropriations, or even if we want to call it hijacking or theft, is nothing new in American culture. But I do believe that the Black Star Line still leaves this legacy of what can be done, as an example. And thank you for your question.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Dixon.
Okay, Beth B, thank you for it. Samira, thank you. I had such a great time with everybody today. Really impressed with the questions, really enjoyed this conversation. And I'm going to put my email in the chat. So feel free for anyone who's on the line right now to contact me with any questions in the future. And on top of that, if there's anything that I can do, please feel free to contact me and I'll do my best. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Lisa. I had such a great time being with you all. And let me explain this. You have a dynamic leader in President Torrance. He can handle it. Tell him what you need. Thank you, Edward. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Phyllis. I had such a great time.
And Dr. Dixon, I want to thank you for all of the folks who've joined us today.
Oh yeah, you got a good crowd there.
To spend time, and as you can tell, things that are typically on the tips of people's tongues, they simply need space and given the grace to communicate it. And that's what you were receiving in the form of questions from this group. I implore all who are still on the line and attending, I know you're headed off to other things that may begin at 1:30 and beyond for the day, for the rest of the week, for the rest of the year. Move beyond dialogue, move beyond conversation, move into action, move into measurement, move into engagement. And it's not enough to see something. It's not enough to say something. I implore you to do something. And it must be at your comfort level, whatever that see, say, and do ends up being. We are committed to being educators and a hub for our communities at Motlow State, which means that oftentimes some of the questions that ought to be begged should be begged, and they may be difficult conversations to have, but they are just conversations to have, to be had. And when I say just, I mean that they are prudent, that they inspire social collectivism, they inspire better will. I won't say goodwill or bad will. I will say better will towards those who live in our communities and who are our neighbors. It used to be said that it was the other side of the tracks, and it depended on what side of the tracks you were on. I say now that it is the world is too small. We're having conversations here at Motlow with people in China, with people in Eastern Europe, South America, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So now that the global has become local, that means it's global. Okay, the global has become local, which means it's global. Our neighbors aren't just the people who live next door to us. It is the people who are contemplating moving to be next to us. So we need to be prepared for the continued migration and shifts that are happening because of the hues of people's skins, the abilities and the variances that they bring to the communities that we live in, love in, laugh in, and thrive within. So Dr. Dixon has done a fantastic job, in my humble opinion, as always. Thank you for your time, your thought, your energy. You're much appreciated, and I can't wait to see you soon. But
Yes,
not
sir.
in that snow.
Nah, we are pretty good right now, but they say if you don't like the weather here, wait 5 minutes. That's the time. There's a part that I like that Dr. Torrance has given us ideas and marching orders. And there's a part of that when I discuss the pain of being non-productive, as he employed us to be productive. The pain of being non-productive makes us seek the things that keep us non-productive. So I employ, as on the back end of what Dr. Torrance says, that you remain diligent, but you remain active in something that will allow for you to sacrifice something dearly for someone you'll never meet.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
To all of our attendees, please give him either a hand. You can push the emoji that says thumbs up or clap, and we'll close out this convening and look forward to the other convenings that Motlow and its faculty and staff and admin have ready for our community. Thank you all so much for attending. Be blessed and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'll talk to you later. All right.
There's Miss Cannon. Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, Dr. Dixon, stay on for 1 second.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Good questions.
Oh, amazing questions.
Yeah.
We had 2 good sessions, one at home and one on the road. We did all right between the 2 of us, dear brother.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did.
We owe much more to this.
We're creating another space where I think that and it's necessary. I think it's needed, and I think you'd agree with it, that the dialogue for cultural studies and how it impacts economics should be an ongoing dialogue to poor communities. And I had a great conversation this morning about blockchain with a colleague from Colorado, expressing a interest in support for financial literacy tied to Department of Labor, tied to economic and community development, tied to skill development, right? So as you started off about the pathway to a terminal degree and what those things mean, creating spaces for people to create their own sovereignty, basically, over the skills that they develop over time, and that micro-credentialing longitudinally should be a focus as citizens, just citizens, not of higher education, not of the workforce. It's unfair to lay that on one group or one entity. I really believe it's a social responsibility. We have a hole, we need to fill the hole. Let's do things throughout the community to tie it in through the agencies that exist, whether they be public or private, or need to be created. But we're discussing the importance of personal sovereignty, financial literacy, and not access, because access is not equity, but this conclusion that we came to, that if we're going to call it badging, if we're going to call it skills, if we're going to call it theoretical underpinnings, how do we tie all of this together so that someone can backpack that and take it with them no matter where they go? And it's being universal, as I was talking about global and local. I do mean that perhaps some kid wants to spend, or some mid-career adult wants to spend a year or 3 or 5 in a foreign land with the skill set that they picked up here, but very much is akin and works where they're going. So we're going to build some conversations around the economics of things, the skills, mental health, et cetera, et cetera. Love to bring you in on some of these.
Let me know what it is, dear brother, that you deem necessary, and you know you don't have to ask twice.
All right, appreciate that.
It's absolutely true.
Well,
I enjoyed myself.
Oh man, good. We want to create spaces for us to be able to communicate these things, and the dynamicism behind the seemingly, to the eye, when people, first thing anyone asks me that is asked about the presentation has not been about Carter G. Woodson per se. It's been about the young man that was dragged behind cars in Wyoming. That's their first flashpoint. And to evolve the dialogue, right? To evolve the dialogue beyond that, I think this is a great point where the University of Wyoming has committed support, and the state has committed support to cultural studies. So they can move beyond that. Elisa is calling me now because I'm supposed to be on my call. So I'm gonna jump off. It's great to see you all. The Campbells, Sang-Yeon.
Yes, the Campbells.
Mr. Smith, good to see you. Ms. Brenda, thank you for handling all of this. I'll talk to you later. Peace and blessings.
Sir. Peace and blessings.